Hello there, and welcome to Explain International. You're joining me, Samuel Nason, today for this exciting debate between Chris Date and Jake, the Muslim Metaphysician. I'll be the moderator for today, and in the place of Santi, who has put me in charge of this. I hope I don't mess up too much. Big welcome to all of you who've been waiting so patiently in the live chat. We're really glad to have you with us. And if you're new to this channel, highly encourage that you hit the subscribe button, the red button right at the bottom there, and hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of future debates. So with that, let me jump straight into it. The title of our debate today is "Does the Trinity Make Sense?" So that's the orthodox position on the Trinity. Makes sense. And let me begin by introducing Chris Date. In fact, why not? Let me just ask Chris if you'd like to introduce yourself, your work that you do. Just tell us a bit about yourself and what you've been up to lately.
Sure. And first of all, let me just say thanks to you for moderating and hosting this. And also, I want to say thanks to Jake. And I want to do that now just because my 15-minute opening is so full, I won't have time to thank him at the beginning. So, Jake, thank you for participating in this. This is much more your wheelhouse than mine. So your willingness to engage with me in debate is much appreciated. I am most known for my work on the topic of hell and conditional immortality with the ministry Rethinking Hell. And in that capacity, I publish books and journal articles, and I speak at conferences, and I debate and so forth. But beyond my work on hell, I'm also known for my defense of Reformed theology, Calvinism, compatibilism, and so forth. But a few years ago, I began focusing on the topic of incarnation and Trinity as well, with my debate versus Dale Tuggy a few years ago, which culminated in a book debate. And so I'm really excited to now take that to the next level and debate the topic of the Trinity as we're doing here today. I'm hoping to come out looking good. We'll see how well that turns out. And then lastly, I'll just say I'm an adjunct professor of Bible and theology at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. People who watch Trinity Radio and are familiar with Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett, they're the leadership of Trinity Seminary, and I have the honor of being a teacher there. If viewers are interested in getting a higher Christian education, but they don't have the time or the rigid, time requirements of a traditional brick and mortar institution type experience, then go to trinitysem.edu. That's SEM is short for seminary, trinitysem.edu. We'd love to learn about you and possibly have you as a student. So, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Chris. And we're also glad to have, for the very first time on our channel, Jake, the Muslim Metaphysician. Thank you for coming on, Jake. And tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to lately.
Yeah, so I'm a Muslim. I'm a convert. I used to be a Roman Catholic. Typically, I engage in interviewing Christian scholars, debating them. But mainly, I'm a Muslim apologist, just interested in theology, comparative theology. And I'm actually, next month, I'll be teaching a couple courses on the course is actually called Christological Controversy. So I dabble a little bit in teaching some of these things as well.
Thanks so much, Jake, and for that short introduction. And also, we really look forward to hearing from those of you in the live chat as well. Those of you watching this live, you can participate in the Q&A at the end of this debate. Questions that, if you could kindly indicate who your question is to, that would make it a lot easier for us to pick out the questions and to address them to respective panelists. With that, let me begin by just introducing the format of the debate. We'll begin with an opening 15 minutes each, beginning with Chris, who will be taking the affirmative position, defending the fact that the Trinity makes sense, or rather the position that the Trinity makes sense. And Jake will be following up with his 15-minute opening presentation. That will be followed up by 8 minutes rebuttal and a 12-minute cross-examination from each side. Finally, we'll have closing statements of 8 minutes each, and that's when we'll go over to you, those of you watching this live. So with that, let me get my timer set. I think we're about ready to go. Well, you have 15 minutes, Chris, to make your opening statement. I'll give a notification once we're about 1 minute away and about 30 seconds away. The time starts at your first word, Chris.
Great. So I want to make very clear from the outset just what it is that we're debating, because this is something of a unique debate. What we're debating is whether it's possible for a doctrine of the Trinity to be both orthodox and logically coherent. So what I'm going to do is offer what I think is a plausible model of the Trinity that is both orthodox and logically coherent. It'll be something like a defense rather than a theodicy when answering the problem of evil, which simply means that it needn't be an accurate model. It doesn't have to accurately represent the way the Trinity actually works. If the model I offer succeeds at being both orthodox and coherent, then Christianity wins the debate, even if my model it doesn't prove in the end to be the right one. So just what is Orthodox Trinitarianism? Well, I want to offer that Orthodox Trinitarianism is conciliar Trinitarianism, by which I mean the affirmations of the early ecumenical councils. So collectively, they affirm the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, they're eternally distinct and personal, they share one divine substance, and although the following two are a little bit disputable, I'm going to concede them for the purpose of this debate and add they aren't parts of a divisible substance, and the Son and the Spirit are metaphysically contingent on the Father, and the Spirit possibly on the Son, which we'll get to a little bit later. So I want to offer a simple summary of my position, and then I'll explicate the concepts involved. I'm going to argue that God is firstly one being. Secondly, that being is a simple mental substance, a mind. Thirdly, that mind exists eternally as three persons, by which I mean one mind from the vantages of three properties. Fourthly, those persons are individuated only by those properties and the relations between them. And fifthly, the second and third persons are contingent metaphysically on the first, and again, the third possibly on the second. So this is a summary of the model that I'm going to be explicating now. So this model base is based on three related but distinct concepts. The concept of self, which I'm defining as the trope or property instance of mine-ness, that is reflexive or pre-reflective ownership and agency over experience and being. And then there's being, which I'm defining here as the substance, or in the case of humans, composite of substances, of which self is a property. And then person, I'm defining as a self along with its being from its unique first-personal perspective. Now, to help explain what I mean by some of these concepts, I want to turn to an analogy from a game I like to play called PUBG. This is the same sequence of events in that game from two vantage points. In the foreground is third-person perspective, and I'm treating this as analogous to what it's like to observe a human being from without, as an external observer. And then here is the same sequence of events overlaid beneath it from the first-person perspective. And I'm treating this as analogous, this visual field of the avatar, I'm treating it as analogous to our experiential field, the field of experience, mind. And I'm going to use it to illustrate the concept of self. So if we pause this sequence of events where the avatar is punching and you can see your avatar's punch in your visual field, this is analogous to being. Again, the composite of all substances, properties, etc. that constitute an individual being. This is sometimes called the thick subject of conscious experience, which means the whole organism, the whole being that is the subject of experience. This part of you that you see in your visual field, that's what's called phenomenal self. It's one's own being as the object of one's own conscious perception. This is not the self I've been talking about, though it could be relevant later. And then lastly, this is the kind of self I'm talking about. It's what is known in the literature as metaphysical self, or self as subject, minimal self. There's a variety of terms for it, but notice it's the hand here is pointing at you, the person viewing the visual field, meaning it's the first personal perspective of experience. Philosophers of mind, neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists use this kind of language. Mateusz Wozniak, the self as subject of experience, it's rooted in metaphysics. Timothy Joseph Lane notes there's a lot of cognates for this: for me-ness, selfhood, ipseity. There's a bunch of terms. Giovanni Stangolini in Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology says it's the minimal self, pre-reflective self-awareness, and he notes that it includes this sense of agency and ownership of experience. Sean Gallagher, in his contribution to the Oxford Handbook of the Self, notes the same senses of ownership and agency that come along with minimal self, or metaphysical self. Galen Strawson, in the Oxford Handbook, calls this the thin conception of the subject of experience, and he calls it the subjectivity phenomenon. Dan Zahavi in the Oxford Handbook calls it an intrinsic but elusive sense of subjective presence. The words for this are starting to make something clear. Mineness, subjectivity, for me-ness. You see, as Zahavi explains, this doesn't refer to a specific what, a substance, a thing. Rather, what it refers to is the first personal presence of experience, the first personal givenness of experience. This is not a substance or a thing. This is something more like a property or property instance or trope. So now let me take these concepts I've tried to explicate and map them onto a diagram that might help to illustrate the concepts. Here I'm going to diagram what it might look like to diagram a human self, being, and person. So this solid circle here represents a human being, that is the body, if one is a physicalist, or if one is a substance dualist, body and soul. This is the substance, the being. These dashed lines represent experiential perspective, the direction, if you will, of experience. Now, of course, it's not spatial direction. I'm talking about a conceptual direction from subject to object. All right. And at the origin of this experiential perspective is self, this property instance of mineness, for me-ness, first personal perspective. And person, I'm saying, is this being from the self's perspective. All right. Now, all human beings have only one self, and so all human beings are unipersonal. But let's map these concepts onto a diagram and flesh out what it would mean for this to apply to the Trinity. So I'm going to argue that God's being has three selves, three distinct tropes of mineness, and that these are properties of the single substance that is the being of God. And because a person is being from the perspective of self, three persons, therefore, subsist in the one being of God that they share completely and equally. And two of them, we can concede, are metaphysically contingent on the first, but could not fail to exist in any possible world, for reasons that we'll get to a little bit later. So returning to a diagram, let me try to diagram divine selves, being, and persons. So here is the single, undivided, simple substance that is the divine being, the divine soul. Here are those lines representing experiential perspective, the direction of experience from subject to object. But note that here there are 3 points of origin for this experiential perspective. These are 3 selves, property instances of mineness. Again, because person is being from self's perspective, there are therefore 3 persons. The person from self number 1's perspective, the one from self number 2's perspective, and the one from number 3's perspective. And internally within the selves, we can have contingency relationships, the relationship of procession or generation from person 1 to person 2. The self number 1 can give rise eternally to self number 2. It can also give rise in the form of procession known as spiration to self number 3, making person number 3 contingent on person 1, exactly as the East affirms. Now, the West affirms that person number 3 is contingent on person number 2 as well, and that's perfectly accountable for in this model. So, I take this model to be orthodox. It maintains Father, Son, and Spirit are each God, distinct from one another, but only in the properties and relations of one undivided substance. And the Son and the Spirit are metaphysically contingent on the Father, and if you're in the West, if you like, the Spirit is metaphysically contingent on the Son as well. This seems fully orthodox to me. It also seems to me fully logical. It maintains that a personal being is a being with one or more selves, but reference to being is reference to it irrespective of any self's particular perspective. A person, however, is such a being, but from the first personal perspective of one of its selves, making multiple persons in one being coherent. Now, what about aseity and simplicity? These come up a lot in at least the debates I've seen with Jake, and I think it's right that they come up, but just to what extent they are critical is up for debate, I think. Because I want to argue that the creeds don't actually insist that each divine person has full-orbed aseity. Quite the contrary, I think Jake would agree that the creeds don't insist each divine person has full-orbed aseity. I do think they affirm that the Father exhibits full-orbed aseity, and my model accounts for that. They affirm the Son and the Spirit don't, because they're contingent on the Father, but my model has the Son and Spirit metaphysically necessary anyway. They must exist in all possible worlds because the Father necessarily, but eternally, begets the Son and spirates the Spirit in all possible worlds. So he is contingent, the Son and the Spirit are contingent, but they're also necessary in another sense. As for simplicity, the creeds don't seem to insist that God exhibits full-orbed simplicity. Now, my model does maintain that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are each the entire undivided divine substance, thereby fulfilling the creeds. But even if full-orbed simplicity is to be accepted, the kind that the most maximally reformed people might affirm, it nevertheless logically requires the distinction I've offered between being and self, because experience, which is being, necessarily entails there being an experiencer, this self I'm talking about. And because even that distinction must exist even within a full-orbed simple being, therefore I don't see any reason why the same distinction between being and three selves couldn't subsist therein. Now, in the last few minutes I want to offer some reasons why I think that the doctrine of the Trinity is actually achievable through reasoning from general revelation alone. In other words, I part ways with some of my Trinitarian brothers in arguing that you can actually reason to the doctrine of Trinity from general revelation, making it something that is not purely special revelation. And I want to argue this for three reasons. Firstly, divine multiplicity seems to me to solve the problem of one and many. Within philosophy, the problem of the one and the many is well known. The problem is, do we ultimatize the one or do we ultimatize the many? Either one is presented with problems. But if God is only one, we have to ultimatize the one. If he's only many, we have to ultimatize the many. And either of those are problematic. But if God is one and many, one being and many persons, well then in the world in which we exist, both the one and the many have foundational meaning. Second, now, of course, that doesn't reason to Trinity, it only reasons to multiplicity. But I would argue, as many Christian philosophers do, that maximal being requires the independent experience of love and unity and relational community, which does require triunity and no more. Richard Swinburne explains this well. He says that love as a supreme good is something that has one person giving to another something that is good for them of one's own, and vice versa. And that requires two persons. But meaningful love also requires two parties at least loving a third party, wanting what's best for and providing what's best for a third party. So if the Father is a maximal being, if he's a maximal person, he will necessarily give rise to Son and Spirit, because that's what's necessary for love to exist. In order to be love, God must be triune, and this is purely reasoned from general revelation. And then lastly, I want to posit that the divine triunity, not just multiplicity, but triunity, best explains the ubiquity of first, second, and third person distinction in human speech and thought. Every human culture and language around the world features at its foundation this distinction between first person, second person, and then third person. I, you, him, we, y'all, they. Every human language and culture. In fact, you and me are both what are called semantic primes, meaning there's a word for those things in every single human language. And third person can be constructed from semantic primes. And of course, every single thought that we have entails first, second, and third person distinction. Well, I think this is best explained by the existence within the singular being of God, three persons, so that they can communicate with one another. God is the great communicator. He has a natural talent for and desire to communicate. Well, that's because communication occurs internally within the Godhead. One person speaking to the other in first person speech to a second person about a third person. So I think that the problem of the one and the many, the issue of a maximal being independently experiencing love and community, and divine triunity best explaining the ubiquity of first, second, and third person are reasons for desiring to see that the model that I'm offering here is both orthodox and coherent.
1 minute.
So just to sum up what I've argued, in fact, I'll bring it up on the screen one more time, just as a way to close my presentation here. This is the model I'm defending. God is one being, a simple mental substance, a mind, existing eternally as three persons, which is one mind from the vantage points of three properties. Those three persons are individuated only by those properties and the relationships between them, and the second and third of those are contingent on the first, and the third possibly on the second. I'd love to see if there's any problem with orthodoxy or logic in this model, but for the time being, I can't see any. So with that, I'll concede the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for your opening statement. Now we'll pass the time over to Jake for his 15-minute opening statement. Jake, the time starts at your first word.
Yeah, if you could give me just 1 second, if it's possible for me to share my screen, because I have
Yes,
a
sir.
PowerPoint as well. One
Sure
second
thing.
here. Okay. Let's see here. All right, so is it there? You got it?
Yes, sir. We got it.
Okay, let me just get my timer here set.
Oh,
Sorry
just
about
just
that.
hang on a minute. Let me see if I can. Um, just give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this would be the best layout. No, to apologize to our viewers for this. Normally we have someone to help us do this, but today I'm flying solo, so I think this will be the best way to do that. Are you okay with this screen, Jake?
Yeah, it's no problem with me. Yeah.
All right, man. The time starts whenever you're ready.
Okay, start
Do,
now.
do, do, you, do you want to click to share the screen? Sorry, to actually go on slide presentation.
Yeah, so 1 second here. Slideshow.
There
Is
you
that
go.
better?
That's perfect.
Yeah, 1 second. All right, so I'm good to go. All right, Bismillah. I'd like to start off first by thanking Explain International for contacting me for this debate. I'd also like to thank Chris Date for participating in this debate. Now, for those who are unaware, Chris and I exchanged material for this debate through video prior to today. Chris explained the model of the Trinity that he would be defending in this debate, one in which he believes is both orthodox and logically coherent. I, in turn, offered some feedback on his model in preparation for the debate. I believe that this was quite admirable and honorable of Chris and demonstrates sincerity on his part, instead of simply being motivated by point scoring. I hope that Chris feels the same about my response. Hopefully, this prior exchange will serve to provide clarity in this debate. My position, to be clear, is that any model of the Trinity proposed will either fail to be coherent, meet the standards of orthodoxy, or both. However, I will be evaluating Chris's model specifically, as time does not permit me to start knocking down each and every other possible model individually. With that being said, I will be offering similar criticisms of Chris's model based on what he said in the original video. If adjustments have been made, which I have to say at the outset, it's been clear that they are, so I apologize if some of this is not entirely relevant to Chris's opening. Based on my response or further reflection on Chris's part, then I will do my best to respond accordingly. So, the debate before us today is, can an orthodox doctrine of the Trinity be logically coherent? Chris is asserting yes to this question, and I will be asserting no. First, in order to proceed, we must understand and define some of the key terms in the title. We must understand the criteria for an orthodox doctrine of the Trinity and what logical coherence is. Let me start by explaining what logical coherence is, as the orthodoxy bit will require more analysis. For something to be logically coherent is just to be meaningful and not contradictory. Examples of contradictions include square circles and married bachelors. If any doctrine is contradictory in such a manner, then it is necessarily false, as coherence is a necessary condition for truth, such that if it is incoherent, then it is necessarily false. I believe that Chris and I actually agree on this point. Now, let's look at orthodoxy. In his video, Chris defined orthodoxy as being in conformity with the early ecumenical creeds, such as the Nicene Creed and others. This includes the doctrine of divine processions, which states that the Son is eternally generated by the Father, and states that the Son is eternally generated by the Father, and the Holy Spirit proceeds forth from either the Father alone or the Father and the Son, as Chris alluded to, depending on where you stand on the filioque. Chris also rules out modalism and partialism as heresies that fall outside of orthodoxy. Considering this, Chris lists 7 points of doctrine that must be maintained for orthodoxy. 1, the Father is God. 2, the Son is God. 3, the Holy Spirit is God. 4, they share one substance. 5, the Father, Son, and Spirit are not each other. Son and Spirit are logically contingent, although he changed to metaphysically contingent on the Father. And 7, the persons are not parts of a divisible substance. The 7 premises are somewhat straightforward. I'd simply add that I understand number 4 is to claim that there is one God. Chris later in his video states 2 additional debatable criteria, one being that the Son and Spirit are aseity and divine simplicity. On the aseity of the Son, I believe that Chris misunderstood my position. I am asserting, as he is today, that an Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity asserts that the Son and the Spirit are not aseity. Also, this premise would be in conflict with number 6, i.e. the Son and the Spirit being logically contingent upon the Father. One cannot be logically contingent upon something other than oneself and at the same time be aseity. To be aseity means to have existence in and of oneself as opposed to through or dependent upon another. I do not believe that the doctrine of the Trinity, by the way, is compatible with divine simplicity either, but unless Chris wishes to strongly defend this notion, I will simply leave it at that. Given Chris's 7 criteria and his wish to affirm the early ecumenical creeds, I think I can think of one important point that seems to be missing from Chris's criteria. I'd like to add that an Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity must cohere with Scripture, and if it fails to do so, it cannot be considered orthodox. I believe that Chris will agree with this as well. All that said, let us now turn to the distinctive features of Chris's model of the Trinity to determine whether it meets the standards of logical coherence and orthodoxy or not. I will now present 4 main arguments against Chris's model of the Trinity. My first argument centers around Date's construal of the persons as abstract particulars, although it assumes that he's dropped this language, so we'll see how this goes. One of the key features of Chris's model is that the persons are defined as abstract particulars and the being of God is concrete. He states that the persons subsist in the being of God and compares the persons to properties, although he maintained that, such as hardness or redness, etc. Chris states that they must be construed as abstract tropes because if they were universals, then they would be identical to each other. The first problem with Chris's model is identifying the persons of the Trinity as abstract properties. This is because things that are abstract typically do not stand in causal relations. For example, the number 1 cannot cause anything. However, the persons of the Trinity do stand in causal relations. They perform actions all throughout the Bible, so they do not seem like the sort of things that would qualify as being abstract. At this point, Chris seems to have turned orthodoxy on its head by making the persons abstract and the being or essence concrete. Orthodoxy typically conceives of it the other way around. In order to evade this criticism, Chris must clarify his understanding of the term abstract and how something abstract can be said to be the creator of all that exists when things like the number 1 and hardness don't qualify as such. My second argument relies on Chris's confusion about aseity. At the 35-minute and 30-minute mark of his 30-second mark of his video, Chris states that the persons have no being independent of the concrete substance. This is problematic for the claim that the Father possesses the attribute of aseity, which is part of the package of orthodoxy. This is because on Chris's model, the Father is an abstract particular, which is dependent upon that which is concrete. So Chris must explain to us how the Father's existence can be dependent upon something other than himself and yet still be aseity. This appears to be contradictory unless Chris wants to give up the Father's aseity, in which case he'd no longer be in the bounds of orthodoxy. Nicene orthodoxy teaches that the Father alone is aseity and the Son and the Spirit are not. Chris, again, at the 35-minute and 30-second mark of his video, suggested that even the Father is not aseity. However, at the 1 hour, 1 minute, and 30-second mark, he states that the tropes of the Son and Spirit are dependent upon the trope of the Father. Again, at the 1 hour, 6 minute, and 45-second mark, he states that the attribute of aseity is an attribute of the being of God, but not of any one of the persons of God. Date at point seems to have another problem on his hands, in which he has 4 things which are divine, namely the 3 persons and the being of God. This seems to be the case when he states things like the being of God is aseity. He then states that you can claim simultaneously that the Son is contingent upon the Father, and yet the Son is aseity. But the Son is aseity, he says, because he subsists in the being of God. It appears Chris is confused at this point. You cannot say that something is contingent and dependent and yet is aseity. So not only is Chris's model contradictory at this point, but it is also unorthodox. Orthodoxy states that aseity is a personal attribute of the Father and not of the one being, nor of the Son, nor of the Spirit. But it seems that Chris has slightly changed his position on this. For example, Gregory of Nyssa in Ad Petrum states, and I quote, "And God over all has a special property or gunarisma of his own hypostasis or person, being the Father and subsisting from no cause. And by this sign again, he is also individually recognized." Notice that being uncaused, or ase, is a property of the Father's hypostasis or person alone, not of the other two persons, nor of the being of God, as Chris argues. This is also evidenced in the early debates the Orthodox had with the Arians, such as Eunomius. The famous Arian heretic Eunomius asserted that the being or essence of God is identified with aseity. St. Gregory argued that the essence of God is fundamentally unknowable, and instead argued that each of the persons possess the same being or essence, but the Father is ase and the Son and the Spirit are not, in virtue of the divine processions. This means that aseity is a personal property of the Father, not the shared being. So Chris needs to first explain how his statements are coherent, and secondly, how they are orthodox. Now, whatever route Chris chooses to take, I will argue that the Orthodox position that the Father alone is ase and the Son and the Spirit are not is problematic. If aseity is a necessary attribute of God and the Son and the Spirit fail to possess it, then would it render the Son and the Spirit less than God and certainly less than the Father? So Chris must explain to us how they can lack aseity and still be God. My third argument is that Chris's model seems to be unorthodox, as his one-self portrayal is inconsistent with the New Testament. Chris may deny this, but it appears he is representing what Dale Tuggy calls a one-self Trinitarian view, and I think his presentation today has actually made that quite clear. This means that there is just one self in the Trinity as opposed to three selves. One reason to think that Chris's model is best understood as a one-self theory is because he draws an analogy, as he's done today, between the self as subject, or I, and the self as object, or me. He also shows a video game in which there is an individual with multiple camera angles or points of view. This seems to amount to a single self with different points of view or modes of being. Date's model fails to be robust enough to capture the interpersonal relationship of the Father and the Son in the New Testament. At minimum, it appears we have two selves, leaving the Spirit aside for simplicity's sake. For example, take the baptism scene in which the Father calls from heaven saying, "You are my Son, in whom I am well pleased." Also in John 17:3, when the Son speaking to the Father states, "This is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent." The Father and Son stand in an I-thou relationship in the New Testament, not an I-me relationship. Now, based on Chris's further explanations in his opening statement, I want to point out an additional problem, which is the problem of indexicals, and that is referential statements that include the term I. For example, I know that I am Jake Brancatella, or the Muslim Metaphysician. Well, if the Father believes that I am the Father and the Son believes that I am not the Father, how can a single mind, which Chris is propagating, believe two contradictory beliefs? And maybe I'll speak about that further. So Chris must explain how his model is not a one-self model and is perhaps better understood as a three-self model, or how a one-self model is orthodox in being consistent with the New Testament. My fourth and final argument is the logical problem of the Trinity, which centers around how statements like "the Father is God" are understood. Does Date's model avoid the age-old tritheism objection? When Chris says that the Father is God, he does not take it to be an is of identity, but rather an is of predication, although I don't know about that as of now. This is because he recognizes that if the Father is identical to God and the Son is identical to God, then it follows that the Father is identical to the Son, which would be the heresy of modalism, which he has already ruled out. However, if each of the persons are fully God and not identical to each other, then how does Date secure monotheism? If Date says that the one God is the being and not any one of the persons, then his model wouldn't be orthodox, as orthodoxy states that each of the persons is fully God. So if each of the persons are not parts of the one being, and they are each fully God and not each other, then it seems that Date has failed to avoid tritheism. Chris needs to explain to us just how his model preserves monotheism, or what about it makes it such that there is only one God. Now, I'd like to recap for the audience the structure of my opening statement and what my four main arguments against Chris's model were. I first expressed my gratitude to the moderator and Chris for participating in this debate. I then explained the context of our engagement prior to the debate. Next, I explicated what logical coherence is and what Date's criteria for orthodoxy is. I stipulated that I'd add one thing to his list, and that being that any model of the Trinity must be consistent with Scripture. I'm sure that Chris will actually agree with this. Finally, I turned to my 4 main arguments against Date's model being logically coherent and orthodox. My first argument was centered around Date's portrayal of the persons as abstract particulars being problematic, as abstract objects typically don't cause anything. This is problematic as the persons of the Trinity are said to be the cause of everything that exists outside of themselves. My second argument focused on aseity. Chris seemed to contradict himself at times when describing aseity in his model. His explanation of the attribute of aseity being a property of the being of God and not the person seemed to be in conflict with the Nicene Creed as taught by the 4th century church fathers. Aseity is typically understood to be a personal property of the Father and not of the persons or not of the other persons nor the being of God. This was demonstrated by my quote of St. Gregory of Nyssa earlier, and I'm happy to provide more of such quotes if required in my rebuttal time. My third argument was that Chris's one-self model is unorthodox in that it is flatly unbiblical. Chris's model is unable to encapsulate the unique interpersonal relationship of the Father and the Son in the Gospels. My fourth and final argument was what was known as the logical problem of the Trinity. What do statements like the Father is God mean on Chris's model? If it is an is of predication and the persons are fully God, not parts of God and not identical to one another, then how does Date avoid polytheism? It seems that Date's model is forced to either embrace a form of partialism, in which case he'd contradict his previous statements and his own criteria for orthodoxy, or he's left with tritheism. If Chris is unable to respond to these 4 key problems associated with his model, then he will fail to defend his position and will lose this debate. I look forward to listening to Chris's responses to my arguments and the rest of this debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jake, for that. And you finished your presentation with about 40 seconds left. So thanks to both of you for keeping time so well. Once again, I want to thank all of you who are just joining us or who have continued to watch this. We really enjoy having you here. And if you're, again, I'll repeat, if you're new to this channel, feel free to hit the subscribe button as we hope to keep updating our channel with more and more content relevant to Christian apologetics. Up next, we're going to be having the rebuttals. But before we get to the rebuttals, let me just remind those of you in the live chat to, number one, keep the conversations in the live chat civil and be respectful to one another. We fully affirm free speech, but we also kindly hope that you would be kind to one another, as really what we're trying to do is provide a platform to be able to mutually engage with different positions respectfully. The other thing I want to say is that the Q&A will be coming up right after the closing statement. So those of you who have questions, you can, even at this moment, if you want to, although I encourage you to hang on till the end, indicate who your question is to. And if you do that, we'll be able to present them to the respective speaker. So thank you all again. And with that, we'll pass the time back to Chris. Chris, you would have 8 minutes for your first rebuttal, your rebuttal period. So time starts at your first word.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jake. I really appreciate the very thoughtful interaction with my video, and I do apologize that I have continued to hone my thinking. Hopefully, it wasn't too far of a departure from what I presented a few weeks ago, and so, we'll each adapt to each other as we proceed. I'm going to deal with Jake's 4 arguments in reverse order. Firstly, the argument that the logical problem of the Trinity. Well, as Jake predicted, he was mistaken in saying that I affirm that the is of predication is the is in the typical formulation, the Father is God, the Son is God, and so forth. I affirm that it's the is of identity, but qualified. It's as I said, the person is the being from the perspective of a self. Now, if one wants to deny that that's in fact the is of identity, they can do so. But in which case, I'll just propose that there's another kind of is that we've never really distinguished. It's the is of personal identity, and the reason we've never identified it as such is because human beings are universally unipersonal. We don't ever need to distinguish between is of identity and is of personal identity. But there is an interesting exception to that general rule, and that's when people claim to experience what is known as dissociative identity disorder. You can have 4 individual personalities within a single human being, and they will, and each one of the persons will say, I am this person, I am this person, I am this person, and yet the individual personalities are not identical to each other. So the very nature of the relationship between self and being is such that there's this possibility that the is either needs to be qualified as the being from the perspective of a subsistent self, or there's this unique kind of the is of personal identity. And I'll just... Yeah, so anyway, I don't think there is a logical problem in the Trinity. In short, when you say the Father is not the Son, you're using the is of identity, and therefore the Father is not the Son, because they are the same being but from 2 different perspectives. Whereas when you say the Father is God, you're saying that the Father is the being of God, irrespective of what perspective the being is experienced from. That's what I'm arguing is the case when you refer to a being. You're not taking into account from which perspective of self that being is being experienced. Jake's third argument was that my model is inconsistent with the New Testament, but that's because he mischaracterized my model as a one-self model. It is a 3-self model, explicitly, because I even had this whole diagram with 3 selves in it, right? It is a one-self theory if by self you just mean a being. It is, of course, just one being. But if by self you mean what I mean by self, well then no, it's a 3-self model. And what's more, those 3 selves include what I described when I was quoting those philosophers in the Oxford Handbook of Self. It includes a sense of agency and ownership, which is foundational to the concept of self. So no, my model is a 3-self model, and therefore does fully account for the interpersonal relationships between Son and Father. And by the way, I'll just add that Jake misunderstood the point that I was making by distinguishing between I and me. I wasn't suggesting that the Father is I and the Son is me. What I was saying was that the difference between I and me leads to yet another concept of self. The me is the phenomenal self, the yourself from your perspective. I was just using that to distinguish between that concept of self and the concept of self I was talking about, which was self as subject. So this idea that the I versus me distinction is something I was saying is the distinction between Father and Son is mistaken to begin with. As for the interaction between Jesus and the Father, as I've said, my model is a 3-self model, so I don't see any problem with that. But here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus is just one of those selves subsisting in the human being that is Jesus. So you, in beginning with the incarnation, what you have is that one person of the Son, having both his divine nature and his human nature, but the Spirit and the Father aren't subsisting in that human nature with him. And so what that means is that when Jesus, the incarnate Son, is interacting with his Father, who is not incarnate, you not only have the fact that you're dealing with 2 selves, but you're also dealing with the fact that you have one self that is subsistent only in the divine being, and another self which is subsistent in, and alone subsistent in, his human being. So that fully accounts for the interaction between Jesus and the Father. Jake suggested that if you have this indexical belief, like I know that I am the Father, a single mind can't affirm that and yet have multiple selves, only one of which is the Father. Well, this strikes me as fairly easily solved by just simply accepting that the divine being has no such indexical beliefs that would be false if believed by one and true if believed by another. But even if that proves incoherent, I think that the concept of multiple selves allows for there being different senses of ownership and agency over one single shared thought. So it may be that the thought is something like one of us is the Father and the other of us is the Son, and it could be that one of them owns that from the perspective of being the one of us that is the Son, and the other one, the one of us that is the Father. It just does not seem to me to be an objection that holds up. Jake's second argument was that the Son and the Spirit are not a se, and I want to say, well, so what? The creeds don't insist that the Son and the Spirit have full-orbed aseity, and Jake may want to insist that without full-orbed aseity, a person is not God, but that's not. But that doesn't go anywhere to this debate, because this debate is what is necessary for orthodoxy, and conciliar orthodoxy does not require the Son and the Spirit to have full-orbed aseity, but they do have have aseity in the sense that they are necessary in all possible worlds, because in order for the maximal being to be a maximal being, it must experience love and community, and that is what best explains the ubiquity of first person, second person, and third person distinction in universal human thought and speech. And so to ground that, the Father eternally begets the Son, and the Father and the Son eternally spirate the Spirit in all possible worlds. So while the Father, the Son, and the Spirit don't exhibit full orbed aseity, they are necessary in all possible worlds, making them qualify, I think, as what we would expect of God, the necessary being. And then he also argued that full orb simplicity may not be consistent with the Trinity on any formulation, and I want to say, so what? The creeds don't affirm full orbed simplicity. Now, Jake's first argument was that persons cannot be abstract particulars. Well, this is unfortunately a consequence of my continued honing of my model, because as Jake observed, I'm not saying that persons are abstract particulars now. I'm saying that selves are abstract particulars, and that persons are beings from the perspective of self. Now, of course, Jake will still push back on that, saying that selves can't be causal if they're abstract particulars, but I don't see any reason to accept that common but not universal belief of philosophers that abstract particulars can't stand in causal relations. Not every philosopher accepts that, to my understanding, and even if they do, this is a unique kind of property that is true of no other property, and that makes perfect sense, because this is the property that is self, which necessarily entails agency and ownership, which necessarily entails the being able to stand in causal relations. So in short, I don't think that there's any jeopardy in my model, so I'll end there.
Exactly at the 8-minute mark. Thank you, Chris, for keeping time. With that, we want to move to Jake for your rebuttal. Your 8 minutes starts at your first word. I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Am I still?
No, you're good now.
Okay, let me restart my thing here, because I need every second on this one. All right, here we go. Let's see what I can do in 8 minutes, because Chris really said a lot, and he's changed his position quite a bit. I'm not going to hold that against him, but I hope he understands why my opening statement wasn't fully addressing everything he said. Now, here are the key distinctive features now that I see in Chris's model. He's still asserting that they're properties of God. At the tail end of this, he asserted that, well, in a certain sense, he's still affirming that they're abstract particulars. And then he says, well, they can stand in causal relation. Well, why? It's just an appeal, I think, although he didn't say so, an appeal to mystery at that point, because the question is, how can something that is abstract cause anything? And he gave in the past the examples of redness, hardness. I want to know if he still affirms those types of analogies, but I don't see how the number one or anything that is abstract can stand in causal relations. Now, he also mentioned, well, he seemed to flip, and he went in reverse order, so maybe I'll do the same thing. He seemed to flip and say, well, in response to the logical problem of the Trinity, what I'm actually saying is it is of identity. When in his video, he said that was incoherent and didn't make any sense, because if it's an is of identity, but then by Leibniz's law and the law of transitivity, which states that if the Father is identical to God and the Son is identical to God, then it follows by necessity, by classical logic, unless Chris wants to affirm some type of subclassical logic, which he's free to do so, but I think is a bit absurd. Then it would follow that the Father is identical to the Son, which is the very thing he's denying. Now, I request after this for people to go watch Chris's original video, where he actually so quite nicely put it that it doesn't make sense to say that it's an is of identity. So I want to understand, if it's an is of identity and the Father's identical to the God and the Son is identical to the God, how does it not follow that the Father is identical to the Son? In order to evade that problem, you need to affirm some type of relative identity Trinitarianism, which, by the way, is merely a linguistic solution and not a metaphysical one, as Peter Van Inwagen notes in his paper on this, which he clearly states that it doesn't solve anything. It's merely a way of speaking about God, but it doesn't explain how in the world this can possibly be true. Now, Also, I want to look at what he mentioned before, that I was supposedly strawmanning his view, although he didn't use that word, of a one-self view. Chris, your view is a one-self view. What you're actually affirming, and which I saw on your Facebook, I believe it was 2 days ago, in which you said you've somehow backed yourself into a Thomistic version of the Trinity. That's right. You're affirming that the only distinction between the persons. Now, this is going to be clear, and now this, I think, is going to be the ultimate downfall of Chris's model, because Chris is saying the only distinctions whatsoever between the persons of the Trinity is these subsistent relations or the divine processions, i.e., that the Father is uncaused, the Son is caused by the Father, and the Spirit is either caused by the Father and the Son or by the Father alone, depending on which way you go, east and west, which doesn't really matter. This is absurd, because the very notion of the New Testament, which Chris is proclaiming, i.e., he believes that the second person of the Trinity in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, meaning that the second person of the Trinity, who is God, according to Chris, became flesh. That is a distinctive action that only the Son partakes in, and he relates to a particular human nature in which the Father and the Spirit do not. So that is a clear-cut refutation of Chris's idea that the only distinctions between the Father, Son, and Spirit, which is key to his model, which is a Thomistic understanding, is that the only distinctions are the divine procession relations themselves. How can you possibly maintain that on a New Testament understanding of the Trinity, when it is the Son who uniquely becomes man? He becomes flesh. This is an action that he takes that the Father and the Spirit do not. And he is uniquely, everlastingly, meaning in the future indefinitely, related to a human nature and human body, in which case the Father and the Spirit also are not. The Son dies on the cross, the Father doesn't. So it seems that Chris has a lot of the same problems, at least if he doesn't want to affirm that it's a one-self model in terms of word, that the one-self models would. And I think it's very difficult to even distinguish Chris's model and a Thomistic version of the Trinity from modalism, because what you're really saying is there's one person that exists in three modes, not three selves. Now, he also, what was the other points he mentioned here? Because I got so many notes here from Chris. He also mentions that, well, about the point of aseity. Let's deal with aseity. He says that they're necessary because they exist in all possible worlds. Doesn't mean if they're necessary. What you're saying is that they're necessary, meaning that the Father must produce them, so to speak, for lack of better terms. He must cause them to exist. Well, first of all, this is a problem for the Father because this is an action which he performs. And if you want to affirm classical Christian theism, which states that the persons of the Trinity are ultimately free, meaning that they have libertarian free will, how is it that the Father necessarily, by an act of his will, has to produce two other divine persons? This means that at least in some of God's actions, he's not free to do otherwise. So that's the first issue. Second issue is that even if you affirm the necessity of the Son and the Spirit, they are what philosophers called necessary through another. They are not necessary in and of themselves, similar to how Aristotle understood the eternity of the world, that being eternal and God producing it somehow, even though eternally causing something to me doesn't make very much sense. But nevertheless, he affirmed that it was necessary through another, meaning by the prime mover. Now, Chris asserts, well, he's now saying that, yes, we believe that the Son and the Spirit are not ase. Well, thank you very much. If the Son and the Spirit are not ase, then Chris needs to explain to us how they can be God. Is Chris going to assert that aseity is not a necessary attribute of God? Well, those same systematic theological texts that he reads, I want him to go take a look at the section on aseity where they do affirm that it's a necessary attribute of God, such that if you do not possess the attribute of aseity, then you can't be God. Why? Because certain types of arguments, such as the contingency or dependency arguments, depend on this very notion that we say, okay, this pen is dependent upon another being, and it's dependent upon something else. Thank you. And when we go back to the chain, wait, do we stop at the Trinity? No, we don't stop at the Trinity. We stop at the Father alone. The chain goes over the Spirit and the Son and stops at the Father alone. Therefore, Chris does not have these arguments or even this concept of reasoning of dependency available to him to demonstrate that God exists, because it excludes the existence of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, he also mentioned his argument for the Trinity about the idea of general revelation, conceiving it of, oh, well, God makes perfect sense of the problem of the one and the many. The Trinity doesn't make uniquely sense of the problem of the one and the many. And unfortunately, my time is running out here, but I will address Chris's other arguments on the distinctive features of what the Trinity goes for in my next statement, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Jake. With that, we thank both our speakers for, once again, keeping to time. We now move to the fun part of the debate. It's always my favorite part, the cross-examination. We'll have Chris up first to cross-examine Jake, and I do ask that in this cross-examination, unless the understanding was a little bit different, that from the person cross-examining, that we only hear questions, and from the person receiving or being cross-examined, to answer the questions without dodging. With that, Chris, let me see, it's supposed to be 12 minutes cross-examination. Your 12 minutes starts at your first word.
Great. Jake, my first question for you has to do with what I take to be your misrepresentation of what I said about what distinguishes the persons. In your rebuttal, you said that I said that all that distinguishes the persons from one another are subsistent relations. But I'm wondering why you left out where I explicitly said in my opening that the other distinction between the persons is the property of self.
Yeah, the property of self, but the property of self is what the distinctions between the relations are, as far as I understand you.
No. I said that there are these three centers of consciousness, these three pure, bare locuses of consciousnesses of agency, of ownership. And yes, there are relations between those three, but what is subsisting in the being of God are not only the relations, but also three selves. And so I guess what I'm wondering is in what makes you characterize my view as one self when it explicitly affirms three?
Because you're using self in a way that is obscure, and you're using the terminology now, which you didn't say before, of three centers of self-consciousness. I can't ask questions, but I'd like to just point out that you didn't say that in your opening statement, nor in your rebuttal. So you're adding that on now. I have no idea what on your model it means for there to be three centers of self-consciousness, given how you've explained the persons. I don't even know what that means.
Okay, well, I'll just observe that I had it right there on the slide. Bare locus, pure locus of consciousness. There's no difference between that and center of consciousness. But I'll move on to my next question.
But you said there was one mind. So I don't know what you're distinguishing between a mind and a center of consciousness.
Let me press you on that then. So the mind includes the concept of experience, yes? I'll assume that's a yes. And there's something like a direction. There's something like a direction perspective in experience from subject to object, the thing perceiving and the thing perceived. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So, what I am saying, sorry, now I've forgotten what the question, what led to this in the first place. Oh, right. So what I'm saying is that they're saying a mind is a center. A mind isn't a center of consciousness. A center of consciousness is the center or locus of that mind, the first personal perspective of that mind. That's what I'm saying. So, and I quoted a bunch of philosophers and everything, but this is supposed to be my time to question. So what in that series of neuroscientists and philosophers of mind that I quoted, where they make clear that by self they're talking about this property of mind, why should we dismiss what they're saying as not really qualifying as self?
Because the way you just explained it again, you said you described it as the self as object and the thing which is being perceived by the self, which is the object of that. To me, that's the distinction between I and me.
All right. Well, so, but as I already explained in my rebuttal, you misunderstood the point I was making with I and me, and I'll just encourage viewers to go check out this
I don't think I have.
interaction. Okay, well, anybody can go back and watch and see that I wasn't saying that the Father is I and the Son is me. So I'm not sure why you continue to insist upon claiming that that's what I was doing.
Because I think you just said it again.
It's my time to questioning.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Now, you talked about the logical problem of the Trinity that has to do with the nature of is, the meaning of is. Are you at all familiar with the concepts of computer programming?
Not really, no.
All right. Well, let me explain something and see if we can agree on something. In programming, there's a concept of classes and interfaces. And a class is an object that has some functionality, whereas an interface describes what functionality can be accessed from without. So, for example, you might have an interface called vehicle, and you might have one class that implements it called car and another one called bus. And you might have one single class that implements multiple interfaces, one called vehicle, let's say, and one called home, let's say. So you've got something like an RV. Now, here's the thing. If you have a single RV in programming, that implements these two interfaces, you would say, if you had a reference to the interface of car that is pointing to this RV beneath the covers, behind the scenes, and you have another interface that is home, and that also refers to that RV in the background, then in programming, we would say that if you've got a reference to the first thing, that is the RV, and so is the second thing. But you wouldn't say that the interface of vehicle and the interface of home are the same. So my question for you is, what is wrong with saying, when I say the Father is God, what's wrong with saying that what I mean by that is the being of God is being without respect to what perspective of self that being is being experienced as, whereas when you mention a person, it is accounting for that property of self. So what's wrong with saying that from the person is the being, but from a specific perspective within?
Okay, so
that was long and convoluted. I apologize. I'll give you lots of time here.
Yeah. No, it's fine. The way I understand it, how you're describing it, you're using the term being to refer to God in a simplistic sense, in the way that it doesn't also include the person or the personal perspective, correct?
It includes that the properties exist in that being, but it's without respect to which perspective we're talking about the being.
Right. And then the person, and I'm not trying to ask questions, but I'm just trying to understand. And the person is what adds that additional content to distinguish from the being, in that it is the first person perspective of the being. Correct? Right.
So it's very much like if we take, are you familiar with dissociative identity disorder?
Not really.
It used to be known as multiple personality disorder.
Just from a layman perspective, but yeah.
All right. Well, more and more psychologists and things are accepting this as a real phenomenon. How they explain it is another question. But the point is that when you've got somebody that suffers from DID, you have one being, but multiple persons in that being is, and it's because what distinguishes the person is this self perspective. And you would say, if you were talking to any one of them at any one time, they would say, "I am this being," but they would deny that they're each other. So that's what I'm getting at. Yes, to answer to affirm what you were saying, I'm saying that what person does is bring this additional content to the identity, which is the perspective that when you refer to a being, qua being, you're not including. So what is the problem with that?
Yeah, the problem is that the being has one reference and the persons have three different reference, meaning they're the being plus the person, the first person perspective. And to say that the being of God, which is the Father, plus his fatherly perspective, for lack of a better term, is identical to the being. And then also the Son, who is the being plus the Son perspective, is identical to the being, is contradictory, because they're two different perspectives. They have different properties. So how could they be identical to a third thing, which is not the same?
I'm not sure I followed that. So if I'm referring to the person of the Father and I'm saying that is the being that the Father and Son both their selves are both subsist in, the Father is that being, but from that one perspective, and the Son is that being, but from a different perspective, I'm still failing to see what's illogical about that.
I'm just going to
Because
ask Chris if you could just phrase that in the form of a question. So that'll be easier for him to respond.
What is illogical about what I just said?
Because you're saying that two things are identical to another thing, and the two things differ in terms of their properties. They can't be identical to something, and yet they differ.
So again, I go back to the example that I offered from programming. If I've got two different references in code to the same underlying instance of an object, but they are two different interfaces, meaning two different ways of interacting with that object, two different sets of functionality that underlying object provides. We could say in programming that when I've got a reference to that underlying object via one interface, it is that object. And if I have a reference to it from the other interface, it also is that object. But I wouldn't say that those two interfaces are identical. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't see how the additional information that person brings with it, namely the perspective from which that being is being lived out, I don't see how that violates anything. Would you like to say one more last thing about that before I move on to a different line of questioning?
I mean, I'm limited. I can't really interact much with the computer example because I don't really know about it, to be quite frank.
Okay. Let me talk about the concept of aseity. Where in the ecumenical creeds that I'm calling the conciliar basis for orthodoxy is full-orbed aseity affirmed of every single divine person?
It's not.
Agreed. So then if the Son and the Spirit don't exhibit full-orbed aseity, how would that be unorthodox?
It wouldn't. That's not what I'm arguing.
Okay, then what, in terms of our topic today, which is can an orthodox doctrine of the Trinity be logically coherent, what is the problem with the Son and the Spirit not being fully orbed ase?
Well, to get an answer, and maybe I'll get it in my time, I think I'd have to ask you a question. But my argument is pretty simple, that in order for God to be, for someone or something to be God, it must possess the attribute of aseity, meaning that it's a necessary attribute. And if you don't possess it, you can't be God. So your only option is to say that, well, and this is what I'm saying is contradictory. If you say that aseity is a necessary attribute, and you say that the Son doesn't possess it and yet he's God, that's contradictory. Your only able response is to say that no, aseity is not a necessary attribute of God. I don't know if you're confirming that yet, so I can't answer.
So what, again, the topic of today's debate is orthodoxy and coherence. And what I want to ask you is, when you say when you say that that a divine person must exhibit fully orbed aseity, upon what basis do you make that claim? Upon what authority?
So again, it seems to me that you're saying you don't believe that aseity is a necessary attribute of God. On what authority? On the authority that I believe that God is not a dependent being, and I don't think very many people are going to affirm that you can be God and yet be dependent for your existence upon another. That's a sort of difference or distinction between creatures and the Creator. That's my argument.
Okay, so just to be clear, you can't point me to any conciliar basis for your claim.
Yeah, I never made that claim, so it's irrelevant.
Well, but it's not, because the debate is over orthodoxy. But
yeah, and I'm saying your position is incoherent. I'm not arguing on orthodoxy. I'm arguing based on incoherence.
All right. With that, Chris, your time is up. Thank you once again for keeping to the format. We want to allow the person cross-examining to ask questions, and the person being cross-examined to allow the person the question to be asked and then to respond. So thank you once again for keeping to the format. We'll now pass the time over to Jake. You'd have 12 minutes to cross-examine Chris. Your time starts at your first word.
Okay, so Chris, is aseity a necessary attribute of God?
It is a necessary attribute of the divine being.
So does that mean that in order to be God, you must possess the attribute of aseity?
Your being must exhibit the property of aseity.
But the person does not need to have it.
The person is the being, but from a self's perspective.
So does the Son possess the attribute of aseity? Is he ase?
In his being, but not in the fully orbed sense that the Father does.
So what's the distinction? Sorry.
The self from which the person of the Son is experiencing its being is metaphysically contingent upon the self from which the Father experiences that being.
Okay, so then we're going back to, again, the point. You are saying that aseity is not necessary because the Son is not ase, and yet he's God, correct?
No, I'm saying that there is an important sense in which the Son and Spirit are ase, and an important sense in which they are not.
Okay, so where do you have statements as far as orthodoxy goes before the 16th or 17th century stating that the Son and Spirit are ase?
I don't. I'm not arguing that the Son and the Spirit must have aseity of any sense in order to be orthodox or logical.
I thought that's
But
what you just said. You just said that the Son and Spirit are ase in a certain sense, and now you're saying you didn't.
No, I didn't say that. I said I'm not affirming that that's necessary for orthodoxy. I affirm that the Son and the Spirit do have aseity in some sense and don't in another.
Yeah, okay, so there we go. So my argument is that to make a claim that the Son and the Spirit have aseity in some sense is unorthodox. Where do you have statements from early tradition stating that the Son and the Spirit are ase in any sense?
I don't have any, but they don't. The creeds don't define that, or don't deny. It seems to me that there's any sense at all in which the Son and the Spirit have aseity. So I don't see that my affirmation that there are some senses in which they have aseity in any way rejects the creeds or violates the creeds.
Yes, but you're making the claim that it's okay to state that they are ase in some sense, and yet you don't have any affirmation of that. So? The Nicene Creed, yeah, let me ask the question. The Nicene Creed states that the Son is eternally begotten of the Father. How did the early church fathers who represented that creed understand it?
I think there was a multiplicity of ways in which they understood it, which may explain why they used less precise language than they could have. My understanding is that East and West understood those things somewhat differently, and individual fathers understood those things differently. I think that the minimum that we can affirm is that what they meant was that the Son and the Spirit are metaphysically contingent in some sense on the Father. Much more than that, I don't think we can say.
Okay, so but once again, to be clear, you have any authority to quote in which that affirms your claim that the Son and the Spirit are ase in some sense. You don't have any authority to quote for that.
Just like I don't have any early ecumenical affirmation of my determinism or my preterism or my amillennialism or all sorts of other secondaries over which Christians disagree.
So you don't believe that you can find that within the Orthodox tradition, those other positions?
Not in the early ecumenical creeds, which is the basis for our debate. It's the basis for orthodoxy.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next subject here. So the next thing I want to deal with is these one self things. So you mentioned in response to the indexicals. So let me ask you this: does the Father have the belief that he is the Father?
I don't know. I think that I think it's possible to say he does not, and instead he and the Son and the Spirit all share the one belief that they are Father, Son, and Spirit, rather than I am this, I am that. But if he must have that belief, then I would just say that if you can have multiple selves in a single mind, then it could be that the same statement could be participated in multiple ways. And so one self could be affirming the proposition, and let's say the other denying it, or something like that. I'm just thinking outside the box.
Okay, so then there's more than merely the subsistent relations that distinguish the persons.
Well, my whole presentation was establishing that there's more than just the relations. There's also these three properties, these tropes of mindness that also distinguish the persons.
Okay, so do they perform different actions?
Not outside of time where the divine being naturally exists, but God's actions in time can flow from any one self, although the doctrine of perichoresis would say that actually all actions that God takes in time are in fact participated in by all three selves, which flows nicely from the model that I've offered.
Exactly. And I'm saying, how do you make sense of that on the New Testament picture in which the Son and the Father are doing radically different things? For example, let's just take one example. How do you explain how the Son uniquely becomes incarnate and the Father and the Spirit don't on your model?
Because only the self that subsists in the person of the Son subsists in his human being in the incarnation. So whereas the divine being is multi-personal, the Jesus' human being is unipersonal, and its self is the self that is the Son in the divine being.
Sorry, didn't really understand that answer. You used the idea of perichoresis just a moment ago to say that they do perform the same actions even in time. So I'm trying to understand how the Son becomes incarnate uniquely, and that's a unique action that he performs. The Father and the Spirit don't.
Because Jesus isn't merely an action of God. He is the incarnate God. And I'm saying that the self that is self number two in my diagram, the one that is person number two from the perspective of that second self, it is that self and that self alone that is the self in Jesus as human being. So when Jesus performs an action, it is only the Son performing the action. But when it's God outside of the incarnate Jesus performing an action, all three persons are intimately involved per the doctrine of perichoresis.
Yes, but then it seemed like you're contradicting yourself, because you just got through saying that the doctrine of perichoresis says not only outside of the incarnation and outside of creation, but within creation itself, they all perform the same action. Now you're saying they're not performing all the same actions.
No, I'm making a distinction between what God does in time as the divine being and what God does in time as the incarnate Son. And I could be wrong, but my understanding of perichoresis is not that it applies to Jesus's the incarnate God's actions as a human being. So what I'm saying is that, yes, when God does anything in time without respect to the incarnate God's actions, it is a perichoretically involved action. All three persons are involved. But when Jesus is doing something, that's the Son and the Son alone, because only the Son's self subsists in his human being.
Yes, but let's focus on the act itself of becoming incarnate. Forget about the subsequent acts. I'm talking about the act itself of becoming incarnate. You can't therefore then say, well, that's related to the incarnation, because it's logically prior to it. It's the act of becoming incarnate. So how do you explain the act of becoming incarnate on your model?
Well, God exists timelessly, or at the very least outside of created time, and the incarnation begins at a moment in created time. So there is no, from the perspective of the divine being, there is no point in time at which the Son acts to become incarnate. And inside of time, the incarnation begins at a moment in time in which only the Son, only the Son's self subsists in the human being. So I guess what I would say is that your argument, or your language of becoming incarnate is itself squishy language, since we're talking about going from the atemporal realm in which God naturally exists into the temporal realm in which the incarnation begins.
Isn't that the language that John 1 uses? That the Word became flesh?
Well, sure. I didn't say it's not language. I just said it's squishy, right? When we say that God the Son became man, we're not, at least classically, we're not saying that there's a point in time in the divine life at which one person started doing something apart from the other two. No, what we're saying is that there's a point in time at which a being started to exist with God's Son being the subsistent self therein. Yes, we can speak of it becoming incarnate, but that's because language only can go so far to bridge the gap between atemporal and temporal.
So did the Son eternally become incarnate?
No.
Okay, so if he didn't eternally become incarnate, he became incarnate in time. How is it a timeless action?
It's time because the action takes place in time, not outside of time. It's not a timeless action. It's a temporal action. The incarnation begins at a point in time, whereas God.
So how are you saying God's timeless then? I don't understand.
Because God exists outside of time. Here's a really imperfect analogy. Imagine J.R.R. Tolkien and the world of Middle-earth. Everything that's taking place in the world of Middle-earth, if that world actually exists, I mean, this is an analogy, of course, but everything that's taking place in Middle-earth is in a completely different time-space continuum than the one in which J.R.R. Tolkien exists. All right. Well, in a analogous but imperfectly so way, the divine being exists naturally outside of created time, whereas, but what the world that he creates is a temporal realm, and God does participate in that temporal realm, but he is timeless in his very being. There's only a succession of temporal events for God in time, and most particularly in the incarnation.
So you're saying that God can perform actions in time and still be timeless. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, I would dispute that. But let's move on to another issue here. When I mentioned in my opening statement the scene of the baptism, when the Father calls out from heaven and says, "You are my Son in whom I am well pleased." There's an I-thou relationship there. And the Father is speaking to the Son. And when I referenced before the indexical statements, which the Father has the belief that he's the Father and that the Son is not him and the Son is someone else, and the Son likewise also would seem to have that by implication of the passage. How do you explain that comment and yet your sort of unwillingness to accept indexical statements applying to these three persons?
50 seconds.
Well, that's a lot to say in 50 seconds. I'll do my best. So, first of all, it could be that indexical statement only applies to God's actions in time, in which case the actions aren't limited to them being all the one act of three selves simultaneously. I'm not sure I like that approach, but that's one approach I could take. Another approach to take would be to say that everything that God does in time for human beings is condescending in nature. Not condescending in the pejorative sense, but condescending in the nature that he is condescending to the level that we can understand. In which case, when the Father says, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased," that statement may be analogical. It may be anthropomorphical. Is that the right word? It may be God exhibiting something that is true about Jesus and about his relationship to his Father, without using without absolute, precisely accurate truth content.
Thank you so much.
Just to clarify, I'm not going to ask a question to Chris, but how long was the cross-examination section?
12 minutes.
Okay. I thought it was supposed to be 15 minutes.
I have it here as 12 minutes.
I actually think Jake might be right here. I originally proposed 12, and I think at some point Jake might have asked Santi if we could do 15, and I said sure when he asked me. It sounds like maybe you didn't get the notes to that effect.
No, I didn't.
So when Chris went, he only questioned me for 12. Is that correct?
He went 12. If you guys want to do another 3-3, we could do that as well. Is that what you guys want to do?
I don't have any more questions, but I'll take 3 more minutes worth of questions from Jake if he'd like.
Yes, I would if that's okay. I mean,
thank you, Chris.
I know it's not Chris's fault, so I appreciate you for being a good
no
sport.
problem.
I do apologize for not taking that into account as well. So
no, it's okay. Yeah, Chris is correct. It was originally 12, and I asked for 15, and now it's agreed upon. So. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just restart at
3 more minutes.
Okay?
Jake, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So in a similar vein, when in John 17:3, the Son speaking to the Father says that you are the only true God and Jesus Christ, I am who you have sent. How do you understand that language there in that I-thou relationship if it seems that on your model, it's not robust enough to really explain that?
Well, I think it is robust enough to account for it since, at this point in time, the Son is incarnate. So it's not the triune God subsisting in Jesus as human being, pretending as though it's actually just the Son. It is just the Son in Jesus as human being. And so he and he alone can say, I am the one that you sent. And as far as him calling his Father the only true God, that's true if, as I contend, God is a reference to the being of God, of which there is only one, but which is experienced from the perspective of three subsisting selves. It's just the self from which Jesus is speaking at that moment is incarnate, rather than his atemporal existence within the divine nature.
Does the Son, while he's incarnate, have a belief that he's a man?
Yes.
Does the Father ever have that belief?
No, because the belief that the Son has that he is incarnate is a belief that he has in his human mind. So
the Son in the incarnate state has two minds.
Well, yes and no. Yes, he does, in that he has his human mind that he experiences from his in the incarnation, and he has the divine mind. He is in the divine mind outside of time. But the reason why I say yes and no is because there is the atemporal transcends the temporal, which is to say that maybe you could put it this way: he doesn't have one mind and two minds or he doesn't have two minds at the same time, but he does have two minds.
Okay, in the incarnate state, does the second person of the Trinity, the Son, does he know that he is related to a human nature?
I don't know what you mean by related to a human nature. Do you mean that he has a human nature?
Yes, that's typically the way that the incarnation is expressed, unless you think he literally transformed into a human, which I don't think you think.
No. I just didn't know. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you meant by relates to.
Yeah. So, does the son know that he's related to it, meaning that he possesses the human nature?
Yes, his human
You've got
mind
30
has that
seconds, Chris.
content. Okay, yes, his human mind has that mental content.
And does the father know that ever?
Does the father know what? I am incarnate?
That he is related to a human nature.
No.
Okay, so how can a single mind have two contradictory beliefs?
It doesn't. As I've just said, it's Jesus' human mind that has the truth statement, I am incarnate, or the other example that you gave, whereas the Father, it only subsists in the divine mind.
And with that, guys, the time's up. Thank you once again to both of you for keeping this respectful, for keeping it lively. And thank you especially also to Chris for being willing to do that additional 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I could see some of our audiences really appreciated that. So
he's right. That was something we all agreed on. So it was all I could do to do the right thing. I don't deserve any kudos for that.
Right.
Yeah, it was a genuine mix-up. It's no problem.
All right. Thank you. And you guys were talking about timelessness as well. And yeah, I got my time mixed up. But speaking of time, we have now. Let me clarify with both our speakers beforehand. We what I do have here is we have 8 minutes for the closing statement. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
All right. We've got 8 minutes for the closing statement. Once again, guys, that those of you in the live chat, we know that some big names are here. Shout out to Sam Shamoun, to Tuggy, if you're Dr. Tuggy as well, if you're here. And those of you who sorry,
Sam Adams. So I don't want to say his last name. He doesn't like people to know his last name, but he's in there as well. He and Jake are the ones who reviewed my video together. So shout out to you too, Sam, is all I'm saying. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So thank you guys for being here. And you can, if you have questions, as I see some of you doing, you can already start filling them in the live chat. So with that, there was a funny comment that actually had me there for a bit. All right. Over to you, Chris. You've got 8 minutes for your closing statement.
All right. Let me just begin by once again thanking Jake for participating, stooping to my level since this is his wheelhouse and not mine. I've really enjoyed the debate. I've found it very edifying and encouraging, not just because I'm encouraged in that I think that my model has stood up, which I'll speak to here in a moment, but also encouraging that I think this is an example of the kind of respectful, friendly debate a Muslim and a Christian can have. There are other interactions that are much worse than that, and there are some that are better, but also don't get very deep. And I think that Jake and I succeeded in both being respectful and friendly, and at the same time getting extremely deep and precise. And so I'm very thankful for Jake's participation, and you, Samuel, for moderating, and Santi for arranging all this. So let me restate the summary of my model that I think has held up under scrutiny today. I said that God is one being. That one being is a simple mental substance, a mind. That mind exists eternally as three persons, that is, one mind from the vantages of three subsisting properties. Those persons are individuated only by those properties, I said, and their relations. And the second and third of those persons are metaphysically contingent on the first, and the third possibly on the second. And I argued that that this model is based on three concepts that were defined as follows. Self is the trope or property instance of mindness, reflexive, pre-reflective ownership and agency over experience and being. Being, which I defined as the substance, or in the case of humans, composite of substances, of which self is a property. And person, which I'm defining as a self along with its being from its unique first personal perspective. And it's my take that throughout the course of this debate, this model has not been scathed. It has not been harmed or damaged. It has not been shown to be either unorthodox in any sense or illogical in any sense. But again, this isn't my wheelhouse, and so it may just be that I'm failing to see something that is very obvious to Jake. I'll leave that for viewers to decide. And if there is any merit to the model that that I've offered, I'm hoping that the more philosophically and theologically astute Christians among my brethren and sisters will help me to build upon this model if it can be fleshed out even more and more robustly. I think there's at least promise here, if I'm right, that it is held up under the scrutiny of Jake's very careful and precise eye. Now, I want to use the remainder of my time to urge my Christians in a particular way, to exhort my Christians in a particular way. And it's the same kind of thing I offered at the end of the video that Jake mentioned, upon which he based his opening, from which, of course, I have since developed my model even further. We Christians need to take seriously the logical and philosophical objections of our non-Christian interlocutors. And I think that when it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity especially, but there are others, I think that we Christians sometimes bury our heads in the sand. And I don't think that that's wise. And I don't think it's loving. Because if somebody like Jake sees what he is convinced is a logical incoherence in the doctrine of the Trinity, then it does no good for us to just simply assert, well, we can't make sense of it, but it's what the Bible says, so we got to believe it. Because most of us, when encountering what we cannot reconcile as being coherent, are going to reject it for that very reason. And so if we don't fail to really tackle the alleged logical contradictions or failures of orthodoxy in various Trinity models when we are dialoguing with Muslims or atheists or people from other non-Christian religions, I think that we are failing to show them love, because we are failing to help them embrace the truth that we know is the truth they need to embrace, because their very life is at stake. So I want to encourage Christians to take this issue more seriously. To my fellow lay Christians, and I do still count myself a lay Christian, although I've now got a few years of education under my belt, for which I'm very thankful, but I still consider myself a lay person. And to my fellow lay people, I want to say, don't become content. Don't let yourself be content with simply parroting a series of statements about the Trinity. Strive to try and come up with, to accept or come up with a model of the Trinity that meets the requirements of orthodoxy, but can also be understood coherently, so that you can be God's agent to people like Jake and to other people that I've mentioned, atheists and people from other non-Christian religions. You will be loving, not just by sharing that information when the dialogues arise, but simply by being prepared to. And by the way, my fellow Christians, if you put the work into that, you will actually find that there's a personal, sanctifying, edifying value to being prepared in that way. I mean, there's a reason why there are books from Trinitarians that go to great pains to explain how beneficial to the Christian life a belief in the Trinity is. It's similar to what is it C.S. Lewis who said it's not so much that he's something like God is like the sun, in that he's the light by which he sees everything. Well, the Trinity is like that. The better that you can make sense of the Trinity, the more an understanding of God as triune will affect your very Christian walk. And it will make you able to love your non-Christian friends and neighbors and coworkers and so forth better, because you'll be able to, possibly anyway, remove obstacles to their embracing the life-saving truth of Christianity that you embrace. But now I want to speak to my more scholarly Christian peers, people that have debated Jake and people that have debated other people that raise the same kinds of objections. If you go into a debate with somebody whose primary, or at least for whom a primary reason for objecting Christianity is they think the doctrine of the Trinity is absurd, that it's logically incoherent, either don't participate in that debate at all if all you're going to do is say, well, this is what Scripture teaches, because that's not what they're questioning anyway. They could just simply concede, sure, Scripture teaches it, and it's logically incoherent. If you want to engage in debate with people like Jake, if you want to, it's going to be scary. It's scary for me. I've been extremely nervous coming into this debate, and I've been very highly encouraged, but I'm extremely nervous. It's a scary thing. But if we don't have the courage as scholars, especially as scholars, if we don't have the courage to come to debates like this one with Jake with a logical defense of the Trinity as well as a biblical one, I think that we are failing to do the very thing for which we're scholars. Our job as Christian scholars is to make sense of these things and make things accessible to people that aren't. But if we just put our heads in our sand and fail to address them, we're not going to be loving our non-Christian interlocutors. So scholars and lay people alike, take this seriously and spend more time to understand it. And I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for your participation. Now we turn the time to Jake. You would have 8 minutes, just like Chris, to wrap up your presentation for this debate. Your 8 minutes starts right now.
All right. Thanks, guys. I want to thank you for inviting me here and Chris for participating in this debate. And I want to echo a lot of things he said, and I agree with that. Unfortunately, a lot of these Muslim Christian polemical discussions and debates don't really go the way that we would hope. And I can see, to be quite honest, some of that going on in the chat without naming any names, probably on both sides of the aisle. And I appreciate that Chris, unlike some of the people in the chat or other people that attempt to engage with me, is quite respectful and seems to be quite sincere in his approach, even if we disagree massively on theology. So I really do want to echo that and appreciate his concerns. Now, addressing Chris's points as best I can in a summary fashion here. Chris, on the issue of aseity, claims that the Son and the Spirit are ase in some sense. And yet he also declares that they are dependent upon the Father and even possibly maybe dependent upon the being of God. I'm saying that this in itself is incoherent. To say that they are dependent on anything outside of themselves, and yet they can be ase in some sense, that in itself is contradictory, because to be ase means to not be dependent in any manner. Secondly, I asked him several times for references for his claim prior to the 16th or 17th century before Roll, in which you have orthodox statements from church fathers, not just creeds, but those who actually wrote the creed, similar to how the forefathers wrote our Constitution, how they interpreted it, what did they say? And Chris was unable to provide any text or reference from them, unfortunately, to show where they state that the Son and the Spirit can be said to be ase in some sense. So on that account of aseity, I think it's contradictory, because he's saying they're dependent beings, and yet they can be ase. That's incoherent. And also it's unorthodox, because the church fathers never taught that. Also want to point out that he dropped the abstract language, but then at one point in the discussion, he also seemed to say that they can still be said to be abstract in some sense. And he asked the question, well, why can't we say that abstract things or abstract objects can cause things? He even said, well, maybe most philosophers or even all philosophers would disagree with that categorization, that abstract objects or abstract beings, things, persons, however you want to phrase it, can actually cause things. Well, that in and of itself is incoherent. Anyway, anyone can look up the standard accounts on abstract objects, and nobody really is going to affirm or really defend the notion that Chris is, that abstract objects like the number one can really cause anything. So if Chris doesn't mean that the persons are abstract in that way, then he either doesn't really believe they're abstract, which he's contradicting himself, or he does believe that they're abstract in a similar way and can cause things, in which case it's incoherent to say that an abstract object like a number one can cause anything and be said to be the creator of all physical reality. Also, it's interesting that Chris, and I like the fact that I'd like to think that through my attempt at objecting to some of the things, maybe he's thought through some of these things more. I see genuine development in his view. So at the very least, even if we don't agree at the end, I think it's been successful in that vein, because he's moving to what I would call the Thomistic understanding of the Trinity, in which the distinctions between the persons are merely the subsistent relations. And then when I make that accusation, he says, well, no, Jake, I'm not actually saying that. But it becomes apparent that that's what he actually is saying when I ask him questions like, for example, when for example, let's take the indexical statements. When I say, does the Father know that he is the Father? If you go back and you play the video, when I first asked him the question, does the Father know the statement or the proposition that he is the Father? He said, I don't know. Now, I would think that any biblical Trinitarian will say, of course. And that's why I went to the New Testament, where I showed that in the baptism, the Father calls from heaven saying, you are my Son, meaning that he's the Father in whom I am well pleased. Likewise, on the flip side, we have the Son saying to the Father that the Son says that this is life eternal, that they, speaking of the Father, that you, the Father, are the only true God, not the abstract being. And I am Jesus Christ, in which you have sent. So there's a distinction in which the Father knows uniquely that he's the Father, and the Son knows uniquely that he's the Son. Well, Chris responded in saying, well, I don't even know if the Father really knows that he is the Father in that way. Well, that seems to be quite absurd and unbiblical, and therefore I would say unorthodox. And so that therefore it would be, Chris would be unable to defend his position at that point. Also, in line with that, this idea that Chris believes that there is one mind, and yet he said there are three centers of self-consciousness. So he's explaining and making a distinction between a mind and a center of self-consciousness, which is very interesting, something to explore further. But, and I'd like really some more detail from Chris on that. Maybe we can have a future discussion, whether in debate format or offline. I'm fine with either. But it's interesting that he thinks there's only one mind in the Trinity. Well, what makes sense of the fact that there's one mind in the Trinity, yet they have contradictory sets of beliefs, meaning one believes that he's the Father and the other says, no, I'm not the Father. Well, how can a single mind have contradictory beliefs? When I bring up this objection, what does Chris appeal to? He appeals to a person with multiple personality disorder. Well, I mean no offense to my Christians, but if you have to appeal to multiple personality disorder to explain an analogy of something what is happening in the Trinity, then I think you've gone wrong at some point. I really request for Trinitarians to think hard about this before comparing God to a being with multiple personality disorder. He also claimed that a person can have multiple personality disorder, and these things are actually multiple persons. Well, no, they're not. There's one person that's just confused that thinks he is multiple persons. That's why those type of people, we either unfortunately send them to the mental hospital to get some help, or at the very least put them on medication, because it's seen as a disorder and something that is not normal rather than an attribute of perfection. And if God is the most perfect being, then why would we compare him to something in created order which is imperfect and unnatural, or not even really considered to be anything close to perfect? It's much less than perfect. Also, the last point here that I want to try to hit on is this idea of becoming flesh, and the idea that it's not an eternal action. He said becoming flesh is not an eternal action, and yet God is timeless. Well, how does God become flesh, which is a temporal action, and yet he's timeless? To be timeless means to not be related in any way to time, in the sense that you can make claims about before and after. Well, we can say that the Son before was not a human, and then he became one. This inevitably introduces temporality into the Godhead, and there's no way around it. And this is why there is no possible way to say that you believe in the incarnation and yet God is timeless. These things will never possibly go together. There's just no possible way. Now, lastly, for those who are interested, I have an entire video on Chris's idea of the love argument, the one and the many, all of those things. You can check on my channel on a video called "Is the Trinity Necessary?" Unfortunately, I didn't get to address it further. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jake. And once again, both of you have been excellent in participating in this debate, keeping to the time. And I really, really want to express my appreciation to both of you, and also to our audiences that have still been following us until this point. So this is the time. We've concluded the formal part of this debate. Now is the time we get to hear from you. And again, you can still send in your questions. We'll allocate at least 25 minutes to answering some of the questions that you have. So I'll set the timer to 25 minutes, and I ask that our speakers be as succinct as possible to sufficiently answer the question. The first question, well, again, since there's been a lot going on in the live chat, it's going to be difficult for me to pick out everyone, but I'll try and find the questions that are most relevant and give each speaker a chance. So first question will be addressed to Jake. This is from Sahi. Thank you, Sahi, for your question. I'm not sure if it's R1 or is it RI. Okay, it must be something in your slides that he's talking about here. Proves the
Relational
Trinity.
he's saying relational identity.
Got it.
I think.
So, yes, I think that's what it is.
By the
as
way,
well.
Luke, you keep calling me Jack, buddy. My name's Jake. Come on. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, Jake, the question is, relational identity proves that Trinity is logically incoherent. Your contention is that it abandons. Now, what does CI stand for? Yeah,
I think
I'll
he
just say
means.
CI.
I think he means to put CL, which would be classical logic. But go
So
ahead.
classical
I understand.
identity.
Got it.
Okay,
You know what?
maybe
Why
that
don't
too.
you just
Yeah,
take?
could
Why
be,
don't
I
you
don't
just
know.
tackle the question straight up then?
Okay, so I'll interpret it the best I can. I think he's talking about relative identity proves the Trinity is logically coherent. Your contention is that it abandons either classical identity or classical logic. But since classical identity or classical logic and relative identity are both theories, why aren't you guilty of special pleading? I guess you need to explain what you mean by special pleading, because I don't see how that would be a case of special pleading. So I'm not really sure what that has to do with it. But I think what he's trying to say is that there is a Trinitarian theory which is called relative identity, which basically says, and Chris may or may not affirm it. I'm not sure at this point, to be honest, but in which the Father can be identical to God and the Son can be identical to God, and yet they're not identical to each other. That seems to go against what's called classical identity and classical logic, because by the transitivity of identity and Leibniz's law, if those two things are identical to a third thing, which is God, then it would follow by classical identity that they're identical to each other. Relative identity says, no, it's possible for them to be identical to God and not identical to each other. Yes, if you want to affirm that position, go ahead, but I think that's incoherent because first of all, it's already going against classical logic, and people who defend that position, such as Peter Van Inwagen, note that it's merely a linguistic solution. It is not a metaphysical solution, because we have no explanation of how that would possibly work, and we have no example of it anywhere in physical reality. Sorry for the long explanation, but I tried to explain what the guy was asking.
No,
Yeah.
I'm actually quite thankful that you took that long, because I'm scrolling down to the next question and I kind of needed time as well. So thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
By the way, do you guys want to respond to each other's questions, or do you just want to just answer the
I mean,
question?
Chris can offer a response if you want. We didn't mention any time, so it's okay. It's whatever.
I am attracted to the relative identity thesis. My problem with it is that it's usually offered. The analogy that's usually offered is that a statue can be two identities. It can have two identities. One, the statue; the other, the stuff that makes it up. So if you were to take out all the internal stuff, leaving just the shell of the statue, it would still be the statue. But let's say that it's also a pillar. Well, if you took out all the stuff inside, it would function. It would cease to be a pillar because it couldn't hold anything up. So conversely, if you were to shave the shape of the statue down to just a bare pillar, it would still be a pillar, but it would no longer be a statue. I actually think there's some merit to that. The problem I have with it is that it doesn't seem to ground how there could be three persons, because persons aren't just objects, they're agents, they have experiences. And this is where I think that my concept of self being a property of mind may actually wed Latin social and relative identity theories of Trinity, in the sense that now relative identity does make sense with different persons, because the relativity is the perspective of which self the being is expressed. But that's really inchoate, and I don't have any more to say about it for this at the time being.
Thanks very much. And we'll move to the next one. Now, this is a question for Chris, also by Sahi. He says, regarding incarnation of the Son, it seemed that Jake, now he got your name right this time, Jake, so was confused by attempting to suggest the taking on of flesh pertains to eternity. Your thoughts?
Well, I just think that this comes down to the extreme difficulty of understanding how anything outside of time can do anything inside of time. I could be wrong. I suspect that even many Muslim scholars believe in divine atemporality. And if that's the case, then Muslims also believe that God outside of time can do things inside of time. Now, maybe Jake's concern was that, yeah, but we're here saying as Christians that only one of the divine persons who exists outside of time that way does something in time. How could that be accounted for if, in fact, all three persons are sharing one mind? And that's where it's the very distinction between atemporal and temporal that is at play here. You see, if you say before the incarnation, you're not talking about atemporality. By very definition, the fact that you're using before means you're talking about temporality. So you can say that before Jesus, before the incarnation, the Son didn't exist as a human person in time. At the moment of the incarnation, that's when the Son began to be a human being in time. But that's not action that's taking place outside of time. It's a really bad analogy, but an analogy nevertheless, is if J.R.R. Tolkien were to write himself in to The Lord of the Rings as a character. Well, there is no point in time in J.R.R. Tolkien's world, our world, before which J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't incarnate in Middle-earth. No, the beforeness of the incarnation of J.R.R. Tolkien in Middle-earth, in my hypothetical scenario here, is entirely within the time. It's entirely within Middle-earth. So likewise, whenever we talk about before the incarnation, we are by necessity talking about what's taking place in time, and therefore I don't see any problem with a triune divine being existing outside of time.
Jake, do you want to respond briefly?
Yeah, I'll just respond. I think Luke was actually confused on what I was trying to say, because I wasn't confused thinking that Christians believe that the incarnation took place in eternity past. Of course, I know that they don't. And my point was simply that Chris actually said that he believes that God is timeless. And my claim was that how could you possibly make timelessness, the timelessness of God, cohere with the idea of the incarnation, in which a second person of the Trinity enters into time and has actions that are performed within time. I was arguing that holding those two things together are contradictory. Of course, I don't believe that Chris or Trinitarians, although there have been some absurd theories that actually posit this, believe that the Son became incarnate in eternity past. So I wanted to clear that up. That was not my intention.
Thanks, Jake, and also Chris. We move on to the next question. This is for Jake. How is it that you are not confusing being and person as all Unitarian apologists do? For example, the Son can be arse in his being, but not in his person, etc.
Yeah, I don't think that I'm confusing the distinction between being and person as Unitarians do. So let me address that first. I think I've made those distinctions quite clear. And when I was asking Chris, actually in the cross-examination section, I believe, whether or not he thinks that the person of the Son is ase, I don't know. I'm still, could be quite frank, a bit confused about the answers because they seem to be conflicting with one another. Nevertheless, when you say that the Son can be ase in his being and not in his person, first, I was arguing that this is unorthodox because this is not how the church fathers understood it. They understood that aseity is a personal property of the Father, not of the one being of God. Because if it was a property of the one being of God and each one of them possessed it, well then, okay, he would be ase. But they didn't believe that he was ase in virtue of the fact that it was a personal property of the Father, not of the one being. Secondly, to say that aseity is a property of the being and the Son possesses it and yet he's dependent, then you are saying simultaneously that he's a dependent being and yet he's independent, meaning he doesn't depend upon anything outside of himself, and that's contradictory. It doesn't make any sense.
Look, when it comes to what's orthodox, there are all sorts of things that a body of people might think about the language they capture in a creed or in a confession. Take the Baptist Faith and Message, for example. In the topic on hell, it just affirms eternal punishment. But part of the reason for using that language is because it's biblical, but also because both conditionalists like me and believers in eternal torment, like many of the people who crafted the Baptist faith and message, believe that eternal punishment is eternal torment. But we both believe that it's eternal punishment, and the crafters of that statement used the language they did to accommodate multiple different understandings of that language. Well, so likewise, sure, there were many of the fathers who may have thought that there was no sense in which the Son and Spirit are a se, but so what? They didn't capture that denial in the creeds. They chose, for whatever reason, for the creeds to allow for a variety of interpretations of that language, and what I'm offering seems to me to be perfectly consistent with those creeds. It says that the Father is fully orbed a se. The Son and the Spirit are not, because they are contingent on the Father. However, they are nevertheless a se in one sense, that is, they share the one being of God that the Father has, and they're a se in another sense, which is that they exist in all possible worlds by necessity. And by the way, that doesn't jeopardize the freedom of God. Everything God does, he does because he is good, and it's most consistent with his character. And I'm saying that the procession of the Father, of the Son, and the Spirit, so likewise is consistent with God's perfect character. So yeah, I just don't think that my model is challenged by the topic of a se when it comes to the specific claims of this debate, the specific topic of this debate, which is orthodoxy and logic.
Thank you very much. Next question by Zubur Theologian. Thank you for your question. He says, question to Chris, when Jesus say, I am the light of the world in his incarnate state, is that the belief of human mind or divine mind? And how do you distinguish what his human and divine mind belief? Before you answer that, Chris, just want to say, I was asked a question by Luke, and Luke, that question was addressed to me. My answer to that is yes. Do reach out to us, and we'll try and arrange that if possible. So, yeah, over to you, Chris.
Yeah, so when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, that indexical proposition is the belief of just his human mind. How do I distinguish between what's his human and divine mind? Well, when Jesus says something about what he believes, what he's doing, what he is, whatever, he's expressing his belief that exists within his human mind, because he's incarnate. But when the divine being is acting outside of the incarnate Son, so for example, parting the Red Sea, or doing the miraculous plagues on Egypt. That is the thing that the one divine mind is doing, in which all three selves participate via the doctrine of perichoresis. But I'll add that the doctrine of perichoresis actually states that these three different persons are involved in the singular act in somewhat different ways. And as I said in the course of our debate, I think it's at least plausible that if one mind can have three selves, then those three selves can participate in a belief or in an action in distinct ways, in which case the whole question becomes moot in the first place. But setting that aside, distinguishing between the two minds seems to be fairly easy, and I am the light of the world is a proposition that Jesus states and believes in his human mind.
Thank you. Jake, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So it seems like he's talking about the two minds that Christ has in the incarnate state. I'll just answer your question. How do I understand it? How does he have this belief of the human mind or the divine mind? I think that Chris seems to be saying that Christ in the incarnate state somehow has two minds, and therefore he can make a distinction between the beliefs that each mind sort of possesses. I think the issue with that, but is really on the incarnation and kind of an entirely different subject, is how you would explain how you could be a single person with two minds. I think that's quite problematic, and that's been a critique of the two mind theory for quite some time.
Thank you. I'm looking for questions for Jake next, but I can't seem to find them. In fact, many of the next few questions are actually directed at Chris. So. And I'm sure that Chris doesn't mind. You've already taken 3 minutes of cross-examination. Here's a little bit more for you, Chris. Question to Chris. Why did Jesus say the Father is the only true God? How does that work in your version of the Trinity?
Well, there are two reasons it works. Number one, Jesus isn't merely God, he's also human. And unless somebody wants to suggest that a human being isn't obligated to worship God as the one true God, then I don't see any problem here. As an incarnate human, Jesus did exactly what is expected of a human being, and that's worship the one true God. But the reason why that's coherent is because, as again, I'm suggesting that when Jesus refers to the Father as the only true God, the only true God is the divine being. Outside of time, the Son subsists in that same being as the Father. So it's true. So it would equally be true that the Son is the one true God. There doesn't seem to be anything illogical about that, provided that only true God is a reference to being, irrespective of the perspective of self, the distinction that I explained in the course of the debate. So yeah, that's how I would answer that.
Jake?
Yeah. Typically, this verse is used by Muslims to try to say that it's actually teaching here that Jesus is not God. I want to be clear that that's not what I was intending to do with this particular reference. What I was intending to do was more interact what I see as a flaw in Chris's model, which I still think it is a one-self model, in which you have an interpersonal conversation and relationship between the Father and the Son, an I-thou relationship, which doesn't seem to really make sense on Chris's view, which you only have the distinction between these relations that are in eternity past. And if you do have more of a distinction between that, then it would contradict his previous statement that seemed to suggest that. Although Chris thinks, and I want to be fair, he thinks I'm misunderstanding him, but I don't really think that I am. So I want to be clear that I wasn't using that in the way that maybe Muslims are typically used to. But yeah, it was for a different purpose.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Jake and Chris. Now, since then the following questions are for Chris as well, maybe I'll just throw in one of my own questions. For Jake, this is just impromptu, and Chris can and also respond to this as well. What are your thoughts on, for example, incarnational sonship? And do you think that would be a better model of explaining the Trinity than eternal generation or eternal sonship? And it'll be good to have Chris as well answer this question as well. Meanwhile, we'll try and find other questions directed for Chris. So for Jake, go ahead.
Okay, so insofar as I understand your question correctly, you're basically saying that the Son is the Son in virtue of becoming incarnate. Is that how you understand it?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Would you consider that a better model, or would you say that eternal generation is a better model?
Oh, okay, I see. So, I think
more logically consistent in your view is I guess where I was thinking.
I see. Yeah. So, I would think that. Let me just say this: if I were a Trinitarian, I would have a lot of difficulty with saying that the Son and the Spirit are dependent upon the Father in an asymmetrical way, in a way that the Father is not dependent on them. It seems to make the Father greater than them in virtue of him being ase. So I do see that problem, and I recognize it. And Christian apologists like William Lane Craig, he just openly rejects this doctrine because of the similar arguments that I'm raising and says that it's problematic. And he would agree with which I don't know if you're saying, but based on your question, that he is the Son in virtue of becoming incarnate. And there is nothing, which is an interesting point, Chris, that maybe you'll comment on that I didn't bring up. As far as I'm able to tell, there is no language actually in the Bible itself that says that the Son is eternally begotten of the Father. In most cases, if you assume an incarnational Christology, it seems that the term begotten is referring to him in terms of his human nature, meaning that he's becoming flesh. And so I would actually argue that the Bible doesn't support the doctrine of eternal generation, and that's certainly open to a Christian. But on the other hand, as the way that Chris portrayed his account of orthodoxy, it would be considered unorthodox because it wouldn't be in agreement with the Nicene Creed. So, that's kind of your options there. If you want to, as a Protestant, say, well, I don't necessarily have to hold to the creed in that way, and I'm sticking with the Bible, and the Bible doesn't teach it, go ahead. But that wouldn't be orthodox as we've discussed here.
Thanks, Jake. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, so to be honest, am tempted to agree with Jake in that I don't think that the Bible supports the eternal generation of the Son and of the Spirit. That doesn't mean to say that, or I don't mean to say that the creeds thereby contradict Scripture, but I can't, for the life of me, find any biblical basis for their affirmation of the eternal generation of the Son and spiration of the Spirit. And this is why in my presentation I pointed out that the last two items in my list of requirements for orthodoxy, I'm saying I'm conceding those to make my job as hard as possible in this debate. I really did want to make my job as hard as possible. And so I conceded those for the purposes of this debate. And if someone thinks that orthodoxy requires affirming those, I think the model that I've offered allows for it. But I really don't think orthodoxy should be considered to require the eternal generation of the Son, because again, I think the biblical language of begotten has to do with Jesus' human nature, not the divine nature. But I will say this directly to your question, Samuel. I think it's plausible to say that the second person of the Trinity became the Son in the incarnation. But I don't think that it's plausible to say that prior to the incarnation, there was only one person. So when you said, do you think the incarnational sonship view is legitimate? I would say, sure, you can embrace that, provided that what you're saying is that the second of three persons in the eternal being of God became the Son in the incarnation, because it's the incarnation that introduced the paternal relationship between father and son. I would encourage you to not go any further than that. But anyway, long and the short of it is, though, I'm not sure where I stand on the procession. I'm, at this point, only willing to affirm it for the sake of not being called a heretic. And I think my model allows for it. And that's good enough to me.
If I could just ask you something about this. So just to be clear, you're saying that you were defending this because this is how it's typically understood as the Orthodox position, but you're not necessarily wedded to it personally in terms of your personal beliefs. You think that you could sway the other way and say, well, no, the Bible doesn't necessarily teach that, therefore I don't have to affirm it. Is that what you're saying?
It's very, very close to what I'm saying. The only nuance I would add is that I'm willing to affirm the generation, the begetting of the Son eternally and the eternal spiration of the Spirit, so that I'm affirming the creeds, because perhaps they were onto something that that I don't see. But if it weren't for those creeds, I would immediately dispense of belief in the eternal generation of the Son. Yes.
Okay. Fair enough.
Thanks for explaining. By the way, the question was based on an article written in 1991 by John MacArthur, where he actually argued for incarnational sonship. But his reason he's changed his mind after that. So anyway,
it's as you can imagine, very related to the whole debate over the whether or not the Son is eternally subordinate, right? I think that Christians right now are going at each other's throats in a very deplorable, lamentable way. There's no reason that people who deny the eternal subordination of the Son should be saying those who affirm it are heretics, and also vice versa shouldn't be the case as well. You guys need to really clean up your act.
Yeah, by the way, just to add to that, Wayne Grudem and his systematic theology, he also, it seemed like in an earlier edition, denied it and then later affirmed it in a later. So within Protestant circles, it seems that there's genuine difference of opinion on that. So we just want to be clear about that.
Yes, Charles Lee Ayerd's thesis was one of those that helped Grudem actually relook at least the word monogenes, begotten. But that's part of an interesting discussion that's going on in Christology itself. But we'll move to the next question. Thank you guys for participating quite lively on that one. Chris, how can the Father and the being of God be numerically identical when only the Father is complex? Property plus being of God, do you deny the indiscernibility of identicals?
Well, as I've already said, I am attracted to the relative identity thesis, provided that the distinction between persons in one single, or the distinction between identities in one single object is the distinction of between selves. But no, I don't at this point deny the indiscernibility of identicals. The reason why I think I can say the Father and God are numerically identical when the Father is not numerically identical with the Son is because, and I am not a philosopher, as I've said multiple times now. This is outside of my wheelhouse, and so it's very possible that I'm out to lunch on this. But it seems to me that saying the Father is God is kind of like saying a moving bus is that bus. Whereas saying the Father is the Son would be like saying that bus moving forward is that bus moving backwards. In other words, because I'm saying that a person is a single being, but from the perspective of something that subsists therein, namely a property, therefore, in a similar way, a bus moving forward just is the bus. But when you refer to the bus, you're not referring to its movement, right? But when you refer to the bus moving forward, you're referring specifically to the bus and something it's doing. Right? Well, so I'm proposing that kind of similarly, I want to be very careful here, kind of similarly, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are God's being in certain distinct ways. But the reason that this isn't modalism is because the ways that distinguish this one being as three persons are this property of self that is so foundational to the very thing that we understand as person, this sense of ownership and agency over being an experience, this pre-reflective sense of myself as the subject of experience. So yeah, is it possible if the indiscernibility of identicals means that you can't say that bus moving is that bus, well then I don't know, then yeah, my model might fall apart, but that frankly would strike me as very odd. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chris. Jake?
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was saying earlier when I was asking you, Chris, about how can you say that it's the being plus the way in which the being is operating in additional, so the being plus the property, which is the person, how can that be identical to the being? Because it's the being plus the property. Well, how can the being plus the property be identical to the being? And likewise, how could a second person, which is different, meaning a being plus a different property, also be identical to the one being when the two of them are not identical to each other? So, I mean, this is just some friendly advice. I really do think, based on what you said, I really do think that your model requires relative identity. And I think it's something that you should look into further, because your comment about the constitutional model of somebody like Ray and Brower, it's not the only game in town. I really think that you can look at people like Peter Van Inwagen and others who explain it in a different way, that don't do it in the sense of this physical material constitution of the statue and things like that. So if you don't like that, there are other ways of expressing the relative identity. And just to be quite honest, I really do think that your model assumes some type of relative identity, and it's what you really need to make it more robust. But that's just my thoughts.
Samuel, can I just say 30 more seconds to follow up?
Yeah, go ahead, man.
Is that okay with you, Jake? I appreciate it, Jake. Yeah, so I've got this book right here, and it has a lot of the kinds of essays that we've been talking about. In the section on relative identity, there is Inwagen there, as well as Ray and Brower and others. And I'll be honest, some of the treatment of relative identity simply goes beyond my ability to comprehend. They get to the point
it is difficult, yeah.
Well, and they use such precise and convoluted symbolic logic and stuff that I'm not versed in, and so it's like reading a different language. But what I will say is this. I go back to the example of the bus. Unless I can't it seems to me that a bus's forward movement is a property, or could be considered a kind of property of the bus. But that would mean that you could say the bus moving forward is the bus, but at the same time deny that the bus moving forward is the bus moving backwards. I don't see how that violates
Chris,
the
can I comment? Can I comment on that
sure.
to really explain maybe this will help you out? The reason why it's not contradictory to say that they're the same is because you're not comparing two things at the same time. You have the bus and then you have the bus moving. Well, yeah, if you have identity over time, it could be the same bus and yet it has different properties. The difference is in the case of the persons of the Trinity is that you have two of them which simultaneously, meaning at the same time, have different properties. Whereas with the bus, you have the bus and then the bus moving. I don't know if that's helping you really understand what I'm trying to say, but the bus moving is not contradictory to the bus because it's not at the same time. So you have to add into the fact that if it's at the same time, if they differ in any way at the same time, then it would be a problem. It's like me, for example. I'm the same person, I hope so at least, that I was before the debate started, even though I have the additional property of having the debate with Chris Date. But the previous sort of mode of me, if you could say, is not contradictory to that because a contradiction is at the same way at the same time. You see? So if you allow for that identity over time, that's what the difference is with the bus. Whereas with the Trinity, you have these distinct properties simultaneously, and that seems to be the relevant difference of the problem.
I'll let viewers decide if they think it is in fact a problem.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just trying to explain how I understand it. That's all.
And I'm not sure you saw this, Chris, but he actually held up the same book you were holding up, but you were looking at your book. So
do we both? That's great.
Yeah. And it's really expensive, by the way, man. Academics got to do a better job of making these books a little cheaper.
Well, part of the problem is not enough Christians buy academically oriented books, so they've got to be more expensive. But anyway, that's not here.
We'll take a screenshot of both of you holding that book up. And
that's great. I love it.
For a book to get. Now, last question. This is going to be the final question. Really sorry for those of you still sending your questions in, but we're out of time. Final question. We'll let Jake answer this and Chris to respond to this. It's very closely related to the discussion we just had about eternal generation versus incarnational sonship. Jake, what do you think it means that the Spirit proceeded from the Father in terms of causality?
Well, I mean, this is a bit of can of worms because, I mean, unless I missed it, I don't know which way Chris really goes on the issue of the filioque, and me explaining the controversy might take a bit of time. But let me just say this, is that the way I understand it, and this is also ties in, interestingly enough, to the further point, that one of the main motivations for the doctrine of the divine processions was based on the identity of indiscernibles. Because what they were saying is, well, hold on a second. We have three persons who all have the same nature. If there's no distinction between them in any way, how is there not only one person? How do we explain it? So they came up with this, and I don't mean it in a crude way, but I think it is undergirding this, assuming this identity of indiscernibles to say, well, if they are different, we need to point to a difference. So they pointed to a difference, i.e. that the Son is caused by the Father is uncaused, and the Spirit is also caused by the Father. Now, you run into a problem here because, okay, we have a clear distinction between the Father and the Son and the Spirit in that the Father is uncaused and the other two are caused. But then it sort of, you ask the further question, well, what's the difference between the Son and the Spirit? Because they're both caused by the Father. So what's the relevant difference between the Son and the Spirit? Now, this is where the Catholics, I think, want to come in and say, well, listen, we've got something for you here. The relevant difference between the Son and the Spirit is that the Spirit is caused by the Father and the Son. And so that makes a clear distinction between them. Now, the Eastern Orthodox or the Eastern Church comes back and says, wait, but now you've got another problem. You've made the line blurry between the Father and the Son because now they're both a cause of another person. And what they want to say is, no, only the Father has that ability to cause another person. And then the Catholic says, well, wait, how are you distinguishing then between the Son and the Spirit? And they say, and this I think is quite interesting, they say that it has been revealed to us that there is a difference between generation and spiration, but it has not been revealed to us what that difference is. And then I think the Catholic is going to come back and say, well, come on, man. What really is the difference? You're saying it's two types of causation, but you're not really explaining it. And so anyway, I'll let people decide where they want to go on that debate in terms of how they understand spiration. Is it merely just a second type of causation that is different than generation that the Father alone does? Or is it causation in general similarly, but what distinguishes it is the agents involved in it, namely the Father and the Son, as opposed to merely the Father with the Son. So I know that was a long explanation, but I hope it explains what's going on here.
Thank you, Jake. Chris?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, the understanding the processions and the distinction between begetting and spiration is a bit beyond my ken. As again, this is not my wheelhouse. But what I will say is this: the most compelling justification and pseudo explanation of the eternal processions that I've found is in Richard Swinburne's work, where he says that love is a supreme good. Love entails one person giving to another what is good of what of one's own is good for them, and vice versa. And if that is indeed a supreme good, and that a maximally good God will exhibit that kind of interpersonal love, and so a single fully orbed ase self would would eternally beget a second, and then Swinburne goes on to explain that that's not really enough for meaningful love. Meaningful love also entails two or more parties working to love a third party in a similar way as between the first two, in which case that would kind of explain possibly what the creeds mean when the West says that Father and Son both are responsible for the spirating form of procession of the Spirit. That is about as close as I can possibly get in my mind right now to making sense of the eternal processions. And I think I do think that the nature of love strongly leads to the intuition that a maximally good being would be multi-personal, as I argued. But I'll encourage viewers to go check out Jake's channel, since he says he's got responses to that on his channel.
Thank you, Chris. Now, this just came in as a super chat. I'll just mention it. I know you've already responded to it, but will you reconsider debating him? I know you've responded. Do you want to publicly just ask him to?
So I want to be careful not to divulge too much information of what's going on here. The long and the short of it is that Smokey Saint and I had agreed to debate the topic of hell on the Standing for Truth channel. And I did that reluctantly because I'd already seen some of his interactions that I very subjectively and fallibly took to be very hostile, very arrogant, very mean interaction style. And so I was reluctant to agree to it, but I went ahead and agreed to it because he assured that he would not act that way in a debate with me. But then I continued to watch his continued interactions and the things that he was saying about others on his channels, and felt compelled to. I became convinced that he was not going to act any differently in a debate with me than he did, not just in the debates I'd already watched between him and others, but also in these interactions that concerned me further. And so I withdrew from the debate for that reason. I don't think I'd turn down the debate for the reasons that he's saying, which is that I was just blindly accepting slander and lies. It had to do with the conduct I had that I had witnessed him exhibit in interactions with others. So that's the story, the backstory, and what I said in the chat. You put it up on the screen. I said to him, email me, we'll talk about it. And yeah, maybe one day Smokey Saint and I will debate. But I'll tell you what, if I have even the slightest inkling that he's going to act with me in the way that I perceive him to have acted with others, there's not a chance in hell that I'm going to have that debate.
Well, can I actually make a comment on that? I know it's your personal thing, but I want to tie it into this whole thing. I would just agree with you. I've seen some of his interactions. I don't want to dogpile on the guy, but I wouldn't debate him either. I'll just say that. But what I want to say in a similar vein, because we've got a lot of people in the chat, and I'm not singling anybody out, on both sides, really saying some things that are not appropriate. And I really encourage people to go beyond that. This is kind of silly. I mean, we're having a respectful debate here. People should be paying attention, listening, thinking about these things, and really trying to, figure things out as best they can, not name calling and all this other kind of crap, I'm sorry to say. And there are plenty of other, Christian apologists, and Chris may even see that, and I would as well, on the Muslim side, of people that you wouldn't want to debate. And I'm not perfect either in my interactions, but I think that we need to sort of step up our game as far as behavior goes and go beyond this. Let's try. I mean, Chris here is, I really got to give him a lot of credit, because he's being quite humble and honest, that he's really attempting to actually deal with my arguments. I mean, my last debate, or my last few debates, people didn't even really want to touch the arguments. Now, Chris at least attempted to do so. So I really appreciate that. And we may not agree theologically, but he's really trying to think through these things. And I see it in real time, because he's admitted and he's changed his position slightly through thinking over these things. He's really trying to figure out in the best way he can present his faith. And I try to do the same thing. So I think that this is the type of mentality that we ought to bring to the debates. I hope that this will serve as an example for future debates. And I hope that Chris and I will probably have another debate on maybe something similar in the future. I think that would be nice. And I just want to encourage the audience to really try to get beyond some of this stuff.
Very well said.
Thank you, guys. It's been a joy to be able to moderate this debate. Thank you for giving me that privilege. We would love to have the both of you back here on this channel. And once again, we thank the audience as well for staying back. It's 2.5 hours of intense theological debate on classical issues like the doctrine of the Trinity. You guys are amazing. And once again, if you haven't already subscribed to Explain International, you can do that. Or you can follow our ministry on Facebook, on YouTube, this YouTube channel, and also on our website, www.explaininternational.com. And just a brief announcement, we are offering a Masters of Arts in Great Commission Apologetics program with the Malaysia Baptist Theological Seminary. You can find more details of that on our Facebook page. So do check that out if you're interested to do it, especially online. This will be online. Some of you have been really encouraging. Thank you very much for that kind encouragement. We hope to see you again. And until next time, bye for now and have a blessed weekend.
Take care.